In some ways, 2026 has served up a heavy dose of strategic déjà vu. Russian and Ukrainian forces are fighting around Chasiv Yar. The US military is concentrating in the Middle East for a potential attack on a country beginning with the letter I, and another nuclear arms control agreement between Washington and Moscow has quietly collapsed. Those treaties were mostly born out of the near insanity of the Cold War-era arms race, where the Soviets and US went from possessing a handful of small nuclear weapons in the 1940s to a peak of closer to 70,000 much larger devices in the 1980s, partly working on the reasoning that being able to glass everything significant from LA to Washington or St. Petersburg to Vladivostok several times over was an unnecessary state expense. Moscow and Washington would reach a series of agreements to dial it back a bit. For years, the process seemed to work, building confidence, reducing risk, sharing information, and reducing the number of warheads and missiles deployed. The New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START, agreed in 2010, was the latest in that long line of agreements. It helped maintain strategic stability by providing for mutual inspections, the exchange of information, and capping the number of deployed nuclear delivery systems and warheads. It arguably helped contain any impetus for a renewed arms race between the United States and Russia, and earlier this month, it ceased to exist. The treaty had already long been on life support after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the suspension of most of those information-sharing agreements. But with its final expiry without replacement, the world is now in a situation where for the first time since the early 1970s, there are now no legal constraints on the maximum size of the US and Russian nuclear arsenals. And so today, I want to talk about the rise and fall of the nuclear treaty system, how one by one those old restrictions began to fall apart, and what might come next now that we find ourselves in an increasingly multipolar nuclear world, where warhead counts are once again trending up, new systems are being designed or introduced, and where we may or may not be standing at the precipice of a new nuclear arms race that some established nuclear powers like Russia might scarcely be able to afford. To do that, I'll start with a bit of the relevant history, how these nuclear arms treaties were agreed, what they restricted, and how they eventually collapsed. Then I'll look at some of the proliferation pressures, new technologies, and risks we're seeing from Europe to Asia that might make just recreating something like the old New START agreement much easier said than done, before finally looking at 3 illustrative scenarios of how this all might play out. A can-kicking scenario, a no-deal option, or a world where the nuclear weapon states try to develop a new multilateral agreement for a more multipolar nuclear world. Before we jump into the lighthearted topic, though, of potential nuclear annihilation, let me welcome back a sponsor. So let me welcome back a long-term sponsor of the channel, Ground News. As you may have noticed, the first part of 2026 has been rather eventful, and that might make the ability to quickly scan headlines or get different views on an emerging story all the more valuable. If you look at this headline about the United States boarding and seizing a sanctioned tanker, for example, that's all the information you really get. But others can add critical context. This one notes it's the 6th Venezuelan-linked tanker seized by the United States, while this one notes that the tanker, the Veronica, was seized without incident. The tool being used to make that quick comparison is Ground News. It reportedly draws on thousands of news sources around the world to enable you to quickly scan headlines, click through the main article itself if you'd like to read it in full, while also potentially getting a little extra context behind that coverage. Here, for example, you can see factuality ratings based on the work of different news rating organisations, as well as one of my favourites, if you don't recognise the source, ownership information. Beyond that, Ground News also provides you with a range of features to enable you to customise or broaden your experience. You can hone in on particular topics of interest, or embrace something like the blind spot feed, which you can use to surface news items that are overwhelmingly being covered by sources you might not ordinarily consume. As I've said in the past, that doesn't necessarily mean they're good sources or not, but in an era of online echo chambers, I think it can sometimes be useful to get a sense of what other parts of the internet might be reading. And it's one of the reasons why I've been happy to have Ground News as this channel's longest running sponsors. And so if you are interested, the link in the description will give you access to a 40% discount on a Ground News Vantage plan, which is the one I use. And so with my thanks to them as always, let's get back to it. Okay, so the starting point here is probably the motivation. If you want to understand why an arms control agreement might fall apart, it helps to know why a nation might enter into that agreement in the first place. As a defense investment option, I'd argue nukes have at least 3 main characteristics. They are singularly effective in the very narrow strategic role they fill, pretty much useless for anything else, all while being, or at least their delivery systems being, very, very expensive. One estimate I've seen suggests that between 1945 and 1996, the US spent north of $5 trillion on nuclear weapons, delivery systems, defences and related expenses. That's somewhere between $5 and $6 trillion in 1996 dollars. Given the US national debt around that time was somewhere between $5 and $6 trillion, on paper, if you change nothing else other than the United States not spending any money on nukes during the Cold War, the US could have come out of it with basically no national debt. Although, to be fair, if they tried to go up against a nuclear-armed Soviet Union without nukes of their own, they may also have come out of the process without much of a United States. The point is, for states that primarily cast nuclear weapons as a tool of deterrence in their doctrine, you could argue there are a couple of common goals. Don't get nuked, accidentally or on purpose, while enjoying as good a power balance as possible with whoever you consider your enemies to be, while also spending as little as possible. That creates a lot of incentive for nuclear and non-nuclear states alike to enter into agreements that put guardrails on nuclear development. New START is just one of those deals. And so to understand just how important the New START lapse is in context, I want to quickly talk about that wider ecosystem of agreements, how they grow up, and then how, one by one, a lot of them have been hollowed out, weakened, or at least threatened. First, a little bit of Arms Restrictions 101. When countries want to clamp down on a particular weapon system, they have a couple of different tools available to them. A valid acronym here might be BLOOM. You can ban something, completely or partially, as much of the world has done with biological weapons, for example, where most nations around the world have decided those are too horrifying to exist and completely sworn them off, unless, you're the Australian government fighting against wildlife or something, in which case, go for your life. Then for non-prohibited systems, you might have limits on quantities or capabilities, usage restrictions on how a thing might be used or deployed, and then supporting the above, monitoring arrangements to make sure everyone is following the agreement, and enforcement mechanisms to punish those that aren't. For most of nuclear weapons' existence, most nations out there have favoured at least some of those elements applying to nukes in at least some way. Particularly given that in the early days, think the late 40s and early 50s, some military leaders were talking about fielding them in absolutely absurd quantities. In the mid-50s, for example, US Army General James Gavin suggested a requirement for 151,000 nuclear warheads, just for the US Army, 106,000 weapons for tactical battlefield use, 25,000 for air defence, and 20,000 to support various allies. That fallout-tier proliferation never was to be, and instead the global nuclear arms build-up would be limited by factors like economic realities, sanity, and a series of agreements that would touch on those ban, limit, and usage elements. The first, and perhaps most familiar, is who can or cannot legally own a nuclear weapon. To the great relief of the vast majority of you listening, and the frustration of a very select few, internationally, WMDs are not regulated like small arms. There is no such thing as a legal nuclear weapon for home defence. And according to the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which most countries around the world have signed, internationally, states are divided into the nuclear weapon haves and have-nots. There are the recognised treaty nuclear powers, the United States, Russia, People's Republic of China, United Kingdom and France, and no signatory outside of that group is meant to obtain nuclear weapons. This agreement obviously still exists, and most countries haven't pursued nuclear weapons, but as a shield against uncontrolled global proliferation, it's always had a couple of holes. For one, it's a voluntary treaty. You don't actually have to sign and ratify it. So the actual strength of the global anti-proliferation regime has always really come down to just a couple of things. The technical capacity of the nation involved, and how much pain a would-be nuclear weapon state is willing to take in order to get nuclear weapons versus how much pain other countries are willing to inflict to stop them getting there. In a bunch of cases from South Africa to Sweden, a country has started a nuclear weapons program and then for various reasons that might include international pressure, ultimately decided to give it up. But there are generally assessed to be at least 4 states that pushed on to become non-signatory nuclear weapon states: India, Israel, Pakistan, and North Korea. As an interesting trivia side note, South Sudan also hasn't signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, although unlike the 4 other powers we just mentioned, they obviously don't have nuclear weapons. If nothing else, I think you can call that an ambitious political stance. At the other end of the spectrum, there's a set of mostly bilateral agreements between Washington and Moscow that even before 2026 were mostly dead. These were the ones that outright banned or heavily restricted certain categories of nuclear weapons. The classic example here was the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, the INF Treaty, signed in 1987, that effectively banned ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometres, so 310 to about 3,400 miles. Part of the logic here was this was a category of weapons that generally encouraged both sides to be a bit twitchy, harder to track and monitor than something like a static ICBM silo, and also capable of hitting targets with shorter warning times than an ICBM lobbed from halfway around the world. At the stroke of a pen, the INF effectively wiped out entire classes of nuclear weapon, and mostly kept them off the global strategic table until the late 2010s, when the US announced it would be withdrawing from the INF treaty, alleging the Russians of essentially cheating it. A statement by the US Director of National Intelligence back in 2018 got to the heart of how the US believed Russia tried to get away with testing the missile that became known as the SSC-8. Quote, Russia initially flight tested the 9M729, a ground-based missile, to distances well over 500 kilometres from a fixed launcher. Russia then tested the same missile at ranges well below 500 kilometres from a mobile launcher. By putting the two types of tests together, Russia was able to develop a missile that flies to the intermediate ranges prohibited by the INF Treaty and launches from a ground mobile platform." End quote. For what it's worth, the Ukrainians claim that during the current war, they have been on the receiving end of 9M729 missiles from the Russians that have travelled much, much further than 500 kilometres in order to reach their targets. Whatever the case may be, the INF Treaty died, and Russia, China, and the United States are all now fielding or developing missiles that would have contravened those old INF restrictions on Russia and the US. Then you have treaties that restrict the ability of nuclear weapon states to actually test them. The non-North Korean nuclear powers all signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, and some the later Comprehensive one. And in practice, unlike the Cold War where countries were setting off full-powered nuclear test shots like they were firecrackers on the 4th of July, these days simulations, not nuclear detonations, are how new nuclear weapons are tested and designs validated. However, that doesn't mean testing is not a controversial issue. Right now, for example, there are ongoing tensions between Washington and Beijing, due to US accusations that Beijing several years back may have engaged in some limited testing activity. As the US Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security told the Disarmament Conference in Geneva, quote, "I can reveal the US government is aware that China has conducted nuclear explosive tests, including preparing for tests with designed yields in the hundreds of tons." End quote. Nuclear yields are usually measured in thousands or millions of tons of TNT equivalent, kilo or megatons. So a 200-ton detonation would be more characteristic of something like a safety test, but still technically outside the bounds of where countries like the UK and France have historically drawn the line. There's plenty more that we could say on this particular point of diplomatic tension, but a big point to raise here is why. Why, with nuclear weapons now being roughly 80-year-old technology and with increasingly powerful supercomputers, why would a country still potentially find value in the real thing? And part of the answer, especially if you're talking about a power like China, is test data. Between 1945 and 2017, the United States conducted about 1,000 nuclear tests. The USSR and later Russia, more than 700, France north of 200, the People's Republic of China, 45. Many of those Chinese tests were also relatively poorly instrumented, so it's questionable how much data they got from them. That's not to say China is incapable of designing new warheads or validating them without new actual test data, but it does explain potentially why countries like Russia or the United States might have less to gain from a relaxation of the testing regime compared to countries like China, India, or Pakistan. So I think it's fair to say that for now, the testing restrictions regime is mostly intact, but it does appear to be under at least some pressure. There was also the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which restricted the development and deployment of ballistic missile defense systems by Washington and Moscow. But as of 2026, that agreement is long dead, with then-President George W. Bush having announced the US intention to withdraw from the 1972 agreement back in the closing days of 2001. The justification was the United States wanted to build up its missile defense infrastructure to defend against potential attacks by terrorists or rogue states, something that left Moscow more than a little miffed. For more than the last decade then, that pretty much left the New START, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, as pretty much the last man standing when it came to major nuclear arms agreements between Washington and Moscow. At its core, the New START agreement, which came into force in February 2011, like some of the SALT agreements that preceded it during the Cold War, was primarily focused on two things: restricting deployed nuclear warheads and delivery systems, and providing verification systems to make sure those rules were followed. Through New START, both Russia and the United States accepted a limit of 700 deployed ICBMs, SLBMs, or nuclear-capable heavy bombers at any given time. The number of deployed warheads on those systems was capped at 1,550, with each heavy bomber counting as one in true Gimli fashion, and a total limit of 800 deployed and non-deployed ICBM launchers, SLBM launchers, and heavy bombers each. Those numbers might sound insane given the destructive potential of some of these weapons, but compared to the numbers achieved during the Cold War, this was a major step down in deployed nuclear firepower, from the globally existential to the merely apocalyptic. The important, less talked about part of the treaty that may now be the more significant loss in this entire process wasn't the armament limitations themselves, it was those verification systems. Both sides had to constantly disclose and share information. Every time a new missile left the factory, the other side had to know about it. Both sides had to disclose where their weapons were based, how many warheads were mounted. They had to release a range of relevant data at least twice a year, share telemetry on their missile tests, And the treaty provided for up to 18 on-site inspections per year for both the Russians looking at American systems and the US looking at Russian ones. As strange as it might seem, this meant that even after, for example, the Russian invasion of Crimea, multiple times per year, you would still have Russian officers walking onto sensitive American military installations in order to make sure that everything to do with the US nuclear arsenal was as the agreement said it should be. Building on the success of other agreements before it, like START 1, START 2 and SORT, New START did deliver a trend for many years of a declining Russian and US nuclear arsenal. Then, even that agreement started to fall apart. Often, major international practices or institutions don't tend to die suddenly or dramatically. They're steadily chipped at and eroded until eventually they break or fade away. To a great extent, you could argue New START followed that model. The COVID pandemic was disruptive to the inspection regime, and soon afterwards, geopolitical factors took over. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 appears to have been a major catalyst. In February 2023, Vladimir Putin delivered an address in which he said, quote, "They want to inflict a strategic defeat on us and claim our nuclear facilities," going on to say that, quote, "In this regard, I'm forced to state that Russia is suspending its participation in the Strategic Offensive Arms Treaty." What other Russian figures subsequently clarified was that Russia wasn't stepping away from the warhead limits under New START entirely, sticking to that 1,550 limit, but that they said was only really an action of goodwill. Something that Russia was doing because it was obviously a responsible actor, not because it was legally required. What they definitely did do, though, was close out a lot of those verification mechanisms. Russia stopped disclosing a lot of nuclear data. Inspections by US officers were suspended. And you can potentially see why, from a US and allied perspective, that might be considered a bit of a problem. Russia could say it was still sticking to the treaty limits when it came to delivery systems and warheads, but without verification systems, this was basically reduced to a trust me bro situation. And when it comes to potentially world-ending arsenals of nuclear weapons, relying on the honour system is a bit of an ask. There was a brief period where DC appeared to try and take the strategic high road and continued sharing information even though the Russians weren't. In May 2023, a couple of months after Putin's speech, we got the final US data release under New START. You can see it on the right there. 662 deployed delivery systems, 1,419 deployed warheads, 800 deployed and non-deployed relevant launchers and heavy bombers, with the column for the Russian Federation pointedly included, along with the words "not provided." Surprisingly enough, public shaming wasn't enough to cause capitulation by the Russian government, and so with no Russian data forthcoming on an ongoing basis, eventually the United States would stop publishing its as well. What probably didn't help is that in the background, there was, legally speaking, a ticking time bomb. New START by agreement had been extended to February 2026. But in order for any limits to remain in place beyond that, a new agreement had to be reached before that date by the two sides. What appears to have been pretty readily apparent from what we can see in the open source, though, is that even leaving aside the tensions caused by the whole war in Ukraine thing, there were some fairly deep negotiating fissures between the two sides. And in the interest of time, I really want to focus on just some of the biggest ones. With the gold medal, I'd argue, going to the United States' insistence that whatever came after New START, New START, if you will, shouldn't once again be a bilateral agreement between Russia and the United States, but instead a multilateral one that roped in the People's Republic of China. President Trump recently posted that, quote, "Rather than extend New START, a badly negotiated deal by the United States that, aside from everything else, is being grossly violated, we should have our nuclear experts work on a new, improved and modernized treaty that can last long into the future," end quote. And US officials have been quick to stress that they want that new agreement to include China. You could describe Beijing's diplomatic position on that particular proposal as basically boiling down to thanks but no thanks. The PRC has indicated they won't be joining negotiations at this time, but encouraged the United States and Russia to resume talks to maintain strategic stability. The reasons Beijing might want to stay out of any agreement probably bear a lot of resemblance to the reasons the US want them in. New START, like a lot of the agreements before it, was built on the assumption basically of a nuclear duopoly. You had the United States and Soviet Union, later Russian Federation, and everyone else in terms of warhead count and delivery systems wasn't really worth a mention. Sure, the likes of US or France had enough nuclear warheads and delivery systems to hypothetically reset either the US or Russia back a couple of tech levels, but given the disparity in warhead count, they weren't a natural target for any arms reductions talks. And so those restrictions and disclosure requirements only apply to the two signatories. On paper then, as long as New START was in place, the United States was restricted in its nuclear activities, but Beijing could hypothetically build and field as many warheads and delivery systems as it wanted. And as we'll see a little bit later on, they're believed to have been building a lot of warheads. They also got the benefit of the US having to publicly disclose nuclear-related information, which they could obviously see, and share information with and allow inspections from the Russians, which presumably, in at least some cases, Beijing might have been able to negotiate access to from Moscow. Essentially, New START gave the PRC a bit of a no-fault cheat when it came to the US nuclear arsenal, while also essentially freezing its competitor's arsenal in place, allowing China to steadily chip away at the nuclear asymmetry between the two. For their part, Moscow has always asserted that if China were to join nuclear talks, then any agreement would need to include US nuclear-armed allies as well, France and the United Kingdom. But with the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal not particularly keen on joining the talks, so far that Russian demand remains mostly academic. The deadlock over who any new nuclear agreement should include mattered a lot, because New START, from the start, was on a timer. The agreement had already been extended once to February 2026, and by the terms of the agreement, it couldn't just be extended again. Both sides always knew that it would lapse, and it would have to be either remade or replaced with something else. As the deadline approached, the Russians reportedly offered a 1-year extension on New START, basically remaking the same thing as was for another 12 months, which, according to reports from Reuters and others, the White House rejected. And so earlier this month, a bilateral arms control regime stretching back to the 1970s finally reached the finish line. Realistically, though, New START at the moment isn't so much dead as reduced to something of a zombified state. The agreement no longer has any legal force, but the Russians have come out publicly and basically said, we'll keep sticking to the limits on things like deployed warheads and delivery systems as long as the US does as well. That potentially reduces the risk of this immediately pivoting into an arms race situation, and given Russia's current strategic circumstances, you can argue that makes sense as something they might want to pitch. Because frankly, the last thing the Russian state and the Russian state budget needs right now is a nuclear arms race. While a number of superweapon and prestige projects are carried on, the war in Ukraine has continued to ruthlessly consume Russian military, industrial, and financial resources. Russia is already trying to maintain a nuclear arsenal about the same size as that of the United States and much larger than that of China, while having an economy much, much smaller than either. Russia does have hot production lines for things like new warheads and delivery systems, but pivoting that system from a focus on modernization to expansion inevitably means that a debt is going to become due in some other area. We have already seen Russian troops in Ukraine go into service with military equipment designed a century ago, launch assault actions using converted civilian cars, and just this week the Russian government had to essentially backtrack on its plan to restrict the use of Telegram, at least in the military operation against Ukraine, as it became abundantly clear, even in the halls of power, that the state of the Russian military communication systems is as such that troops and commanders are relying heavily on a civilian messaging system in order to make the whole thing work. There is a long, long list of additional equipment that might boost the combat power of Russian troops fighting in Ukraine. Additional strategic nuclear weapons that will hopefully never be fired aren't one of them. And so in that respect, at least for now, an extension as is probably in Russia's best interests. It enables them to maintain a degree of nuclear parity with the United States without having to really pay to do so. But a major asterisk to stack against all of these informal or semi-formal extension proposals is that, at least from what we've seen so far, a lot of them don't appear to reboot the transparency mechanisms, the disclosures, the inspections, the things that enable either side to confirm that the other is doing what they're meant to do. And if the goal is strategic stability, especially when it comes to things like nuclear weapons, I'd argue there's all the difference in the world between trust and trust but verify. In terms of nuclear proliferation risk and the chance of a new arms race in a post-New START world, there's also a wider context here. Because after years of net warhead reductions around the world, we're now at a point where multiple factors are coming together at the same time to push things back in the other direction, lifting the amount of global nuclear weapon spending and potentially disrupting the old balance. In raw quantitative terms, as we touched on earlier, the biggest factor here is the People's Republic of China. For decades, by global standards, China maintained a relatively small nuclear arsenal, roughly the same size as that of the UK or France. And indeed, there's actually a RAND report suggesting that as late as 1996, if the US had launched a nuclear first strike against China's strategic forces, depending on the alert status, you might only see 4 to 9 Chinese warheads survive the first strike. In recent years, though, analysts assess the Chinese arsenal has been growing and growing fast, likely adding more total warheads on an annual basis than every other nuclear arsenal globally combined. As you can see on screen, estimates and projections vary by source and methodology, but the CIPRI estimate is that China's been adding about 100 warheads per year since 2023 and now has at least 600. That puts China, in terms of warhead count, well above previous peers like the UK and France, but still well short of the old Cold War warriors. China now occupies essentially a B-tier position compared to Russia and the US, and they're narrowing that gap with every year that passes. That in turn has knock-on effects for strategic thinking not just in the United States, but also for places like India. And anything that impacts Indian nuclear planning or procurement is obviously going to draw a lot of attention from Islamabad. Then, half a world away, there are also new pressures in Europe, arguably driven both by greater fear of Russia on one hand and reduced confidence in the extended US nuclear umbrella on the other. The pressures here arguably fall into two main categories. Non-nuclear European states like Germany, Poland or Sweden, who appear to be looking to shore up their nuclear deterrent situation beyond just relying on the United States. A lot of those countries could be considered threshold nuclear. That is, they have the know-how, technology and resources necessary to relatively quickly assemble a basic nuclear device if they ever chose to do so. Sweden in particular got fairly close to the bomb during the Cold War, going so far as to conceptualise a supersonic bomber, the Saab 36, that would have been capable of delivering nuclear bombs. For obvious reasons though, flat-pack fission bombs would be a relatively extreme step even at this point, and so most discussion so far instead appears focused on greater nuclear cooperation with France, the UK or both. That could potentially allow countries to rely on more than one nuclear umbrella at the same time, but for the nuclear powers, it might present an issue. If your nuclear arsenal is right-sized for a certain mission, and then that mission expands, you might potentially need a larger nuclear arsenal. At least to some extent, it looks like France might already be heading in that direction. They've already announced they'll be establishing a new nuclear-capable airbase, which will support additional Rafales capable of deploying a new generation of air-launched nuclear weapons. By 2035, the plan is apparently to have new air-launched hypersonic nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, presumably because warning shots are more compelling when they arrive at 8 times the speed of sound. But whether we see additional nuclear expansions announced in Europe to hedge the US nuclear umbrella is something that remains to be seen. And around the world, the list really does go on. US nuclear spending is up as much of the triad is being refreshed, but there are also plans to bring back extinct weapons categories, like ship-launched nuclear cruise missiles. All the while around the world, there are a number of countries who are looking very nervously at their surroundings and either hovering at or moving closer towards what you might call nuclear threshold status. That level, as we described with some of the Europeans, where you don't have nuclear weapons, but if you dropped everything and scrambled to build one, you could probably pull one and a delivery system together relatively quickly. Japan and the Republic of Korea are arguably countries that fall into that category. They have nuclear power, talented engineers and scientists, and delivery systems that could potentially work for a nuclear warhead. Iran, especially before Operation Midnight Hammer, might have been another, and if nothing changes, other countries might steadily be getting closer as well. The proposed nuclear deal between the United States and Saudi Arabia comes to mind there. The other important part of modern nuclear arms context that I think bears mentioning isn't so much to do with nations or warheads. It has to do with specific technologies or weapon systems, especially those that either didn't exist when New START or preceding agreements were created, or which did, but fell through the cracks of being regulated by them. One arguable blind spot for New START, for example, depending on the term you want to use, were tactical, non-strategic or pre-strategic nuclear weapons. Personally, I can understand the argument that any nuclear device several times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki is plenty strategic in nature, no matter the system it's mounted to. But the distinction in New START was based on the delivery system. It regulated delivery and warheads for ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers. But that obviously leaves a very, very wide definitional gap that you could easily fly the likes of a nuclear-tipped Iskander or drop a B-61 for an F-35 right through. Russia in particular is believed to have a fairly large arsenal of non-strategic nuclear weapons, while the US is believed to have well north of 200 B-61 nuclear gravity bombs that, as far as an agreement like New START are concerned, aren't strategic weapons and don't need to be limited. But one imagines if you're one of the millions of Europeans living within 500 kilometres of the Russian border, or you live in a Russian city where an F-35 supported by mid-air refuelling can potentially reach, those systems might potentially feel plenty strategic to you. Then you have more novel systems, the likes of nuclear-armed hypersonic glide vehicles or hypersonic cruise missiles. Depending on the exact characteristic of the system, these might represent novel challenges for missile defence, ways to reduce potential warning time before a warhead impacts, or both. When New START was signed, let alone when the first arms treaties were agreed during the Cold War, manoeuvring hypersonic glide vehicles or cruise missiles were nowhere near as far along in their development as they are now. And at least the Russians already claimed to have a nuclear-capable HTV in service, avant-garde. But in terms of the warhead limits of something like New START, there wouldn't be much or any distinction between a HTV lofted by an ICBM and a more conventional re-entry vehicle. Recent years have also seen the emergence of more autonomous nuclear weapon systems, including at least one design, courtesy of the Russians, for an uncrewed underwater vehicle, essentially a long-range drone torpedo armed with a large nuclear warhead. It's hard to argue that Poseidon is likely intended to function as anything other than a strategic weapon. Based on what the Russians have disclosed about it, it would likely be at its most useful, targeting a port city. But even if it's pretty much explicitly designed to be a strategic city buster, as far as New START's concerned, this is obviously a non-strategic nuclear weapon, because it isn't an ICBM, an SLBM, or a heavy bomber. Perhaps unsurprising then that Russia would be extremely interested in extending an agreement which just so happens not to regulate or limit some of the most recent and novel nuclear weapon designs. And also outside the major nuclear power context, we've also seen other relevant technologies become more common as well. MIRV and MARV technology, for example, appears to be becoming more common, making it possible for even some of the smaller nuclear arsenals like India to pose a lot more threat even to targets with missile defence systems, or just pack more destructive capacity into a single delivery system. But of course, as a purely bilateral agreement, New START didn't touch on any of that. The point is that while New START was undeniably useful in creating certainty and limiting arms growth between the United States and Russia, it and the agreements before it were conceived in a very different nuclear landscape. Compared to the 1970s or 80s, nuclear arsenals are now increasingly diverse, spread over a large number of countries, and based on a broader suite of delivery systems, something which might make it even harder for the old bilateral US-Russia model to actually reliably keep a cap on global nuclear spending and limit the risk of Vault-Tec becoming a viable business model. That being the case, what might come next? Because while there's a near infinite set of options available to Washington and Moscow, and good luck trying to predict anything reliably in 2026, in terms of just getting a rough sense of where this might go, I wanted to look at three broad options. Option one is that Moscow and Washington, at least for now, agree to kick the can down the road. They take up some version of the Russian proposal that both sides continue to limit their deployed warheads and delivery systems at least for a while, say 6 to 12 months, allowing time for additional negotiations to play out. That would help put to bed, at least in the short term, any fears of an immediate disruption to the nuclear status quo. But what it obviously wouldn't do by its very nature is resolve any of the underlying issues we just talked about. US apprehensions about the Chinese nuclear arsenal, or novel weapon systems designed to penetrate missile defences, or Russian concerns, for example, about US missile defence capabilities. Eventually then both sides would find themselves back at square one, with the issues they were concerned about being even more acute. US missile defences that Russia doesn't like will continue expanding, while the gap between the US and Chinese arsenal will continue narrowing. Eventually then, something will have to give, whether that means one or both of the countries giving up on at least some of their core demands, or two illustrative alternative scenarios that I want to dig into. One where there's no deal and the restrictions break down properly, and another future where there potentially is a deal, just a very different type of one. In a no-deal scenario, we already have some clue as to what might change in the short term. Long before the United States and Russia could build any new warheads, they could move to deploy a shit ton more of those they already have. New START was only ever really concerned with warheads that were deployed. For example, a warhead mated to a missile sitting in a silo ready to go. But both the US and Russia have more warheads sitting in reserve and even more decommissioned and waiting for retirement than they do linked to a delivery system and ready to fly. One 2025 estimate by the Federation of American Scientists was that between them, Russia and the United States actually had very roughly 4,500 nuclear warheads in that reserve/non-deployed category. And so if those states are looking for a quick way to ramp up their nuclear posture in a post-New START world without spending huge amounts of money on new warheads or new delivery systems, what they can potentially try and do is get some of those munitions out of the storage bunkers and onto the missiles. Back in 2025, we heard from the US Air Force's Global Strike Command that if New START lapsed, they were prepared, if ordered, to load more warheads onto their Minuteman III ICBMs and restore some of the nuclear capability to the B-52 fleet that had previously been removed. The comment about the Minuteman III is probably the one that matters most there. As designed, America's current ground-launched ICBMs are capable of mounting up to 3 MIRVs. But as a result of policy decisions and agreements with the Russians, for a long time now, they've only been deployed with one. Hypothetically meaning that if you have the warheads available and a decision is made to do it, it's not that difficult to roughly triple the nuclear firepower that a single American missile in its silo represents. As of 2025, the US is believed to maintain 400 active Minuteman III ICBMs. So one warhead per missile, either a W-78 or W-87 in the 300 plus kiloton range, gets you a total of 400 deployed warheads with a bunch of kick behind them. But according to Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists estimates for the same year, there are an additional 400 warheads for those missiles sitting in reserve. Meaning, if the United States decided to go all out, they might be able to roughly double the firepower of the existing ICBM force fairly quickly and relatively cheaply. There's also the potential for America's SLBM force, controlled by the Navy, to mount additional warheads. And then there's scope for other nuclear delivery systems as well. The point is, while you can only take this approach so far, you're limited by the delivery systems and warheads you already have available. The sheer number of reserve weapons makes the potential jump in destructive power just massive. Adding an additional 400 warheads to the Minuteman fleet, for example, would boost the US deployed warhead count by a number equal to roughly 4 years of current Chinese production, without the US actually building any additional warheads. Beyond just deployed warhead count though, in a no-deal scenario, there are a couple of key unknowns. One, what does it mean for nuclear doctrine, deployment, and risks if the major nuclear powers are no longer sharing information with one another and allowing inspections? I do think it's possible to overhype this point. Modern surveillance technology is very, very good, and both Russia and the United States possess a quite well-developed, very survivable second strike capability. So there's a very strong incentive, even if information isn't being shared, against one side ever attempting a nuclear first strike against the other. Frankly, whether you have inspectors checking whether there are shenanigans going on or not, for now, there's realistically only one way an exchange like that would end. But I do think it'll be interesting to see whether the respective capitals come up with some new formal or even informal mechanisms to replace at least some of what was lost since New START began to break down. The longer-term question in any no-deal scenario is whether the United States and/or Russia will decide to take the expensive step of graduating from just deploying more warheads they already have to actively constructing new ones and new delivery systems for them. This would be a very different and very expensive step. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States has mostly been coasting on its leftovers. It actually ceased producing new plutonium pits for nuclear warheads many years ago. That capability is now being restored, and the first new pits have been successfully created, with the stated goal being revitalising the US nuclear weapons industrial base to the point where it can produce at least 80 plutonium pits a year. Given nuclear warheads do age out, and a lot of the current inventory is going to need replacing just for the total numbers to tread water, if either Russia or the United States wanted to pivot from mostly maintaining their warhead count to actively building on it at something like the pace the Chinese are managing, you'd expect a lot of money and resources would have to be funneled into the system over multiple years. And at the moment, it seems unlikely that we're in the process of that happening. Russia's military spending is notoriously opaque, but with the war in Ukraine being the budgetary hungry hippo that it is, I find the suggestion they've been secretly gearing up for years for a massive nuclear arms build-out to be a credibility stretch worthy of a seasoned bullshit artist. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Congressional Budget Office has already been projecting that between 2025 and 2034, US nuclear weapon-related spending is already going to total about $95 billion per year, with some of that driven by the capability of the Sentinel program to function as an incredibly efficient money furnace. Going further, the uncontrolled arms race scenario would probably require significant additional budget. And if the White House ever decides to go down that route, we'll probably see evidence in the budget papers long before we see the US start cranking out warheads like it's 1961. And even if there was a desire in Washington to go down that road of a significant warhead build-out, a no-deal universe in which you might want to do that, because, for example, the Russians are deploying more warheads while the Chinese continue to produce new ones, would also be a universe where your budget has a whole bunch of other problems. Like, for example, how do you rescale and recost all of your missile defense stuff, think Golden Dome, and now that you have to expect your peer or near-peer competitors to be able to throw a lot more threats against it. There are more complications we can go into, but by now you probably get the point. A no-deal scenario wouldn't necessarily be a global catastrophe. Mutually assured destruction would still be in place, as would the economic incentive for countries not to bankrupt themselves just turning out as many warheads as possible. Yes, the nuclear balance might shift, but realistically, if your deterrent is still sufficiently scary and survivable and capable of doing whatever it is your security strategy says you need to be able to do, that might not be an issue. And indeed, a state might come to a conclusion that they can actually gain a relative strategic advantage by watching their competitors pour ever more funding into the nuclear weapon money pit, while keeping their own deterrent efficient and diverting resources to other priorities. AKA, logic does not make a nuclear arms race inevitable just because there's no treaty in place. But it would also potentially be a world of more deployed warheads, more cost, and less transparency than the ones some of these nuclear treaties had attempted to create. And in that respect, to put the defence economics hat on for a moment, the disappearance of some of the old certainty that these agreements provided might be one of the most dangerous losses. Because if you have a pretty good idea of how many warheads and how many delivery systems your primary competitors have right now and are going to have into the future, it might be reasonable for you to get by only investing enough in your nuclear weapons industrial base to sustain that kind of force level. But those investments, as well as being very expensive, have very long lead times. You can't just recruit a bunch of 18-year-olds, put them through a one-week online training course, and transfer them to manufacturing plutonium pits. or rather, you can, but in that case, congratulations on your National Darwin Award. So if I don't realistically know if in 10 or 15 years I'm going to need a 1,500 warhead force or a 6,000 warhead force, unless you potentially want to risk being caught off guard, you might be incentivized to build up your nuclear weapons industrial base to the point where you could support that 6,000 level if needed. But if you do that, as well as spending a shit ton of money, you run the risk that your opponent sees you building up that capacity, concluding that you might secretly be planning for that 6,000 warhead force even if you say you're not, and consequently hedging their bets by building out more production capacity of their own, which in turn your intelligence agencies might see, causing the strategists to revise their estimates on just how big a future force might need to be, leading to calls to yet more expansion to the nuclear weapon industrial base. The point is, these arms limitation treaties didn't just allow for a safer world through fewer deployed weapons, or for the US and Russia to save money when it came to procuring warheads and delivery systems. They also enabled them to scale down the old nuclear weapons industrial complex. And with less of that old certainty to go around, countries might be less able or willing to make those kind of savings going forward. What about a third scenario then? One where you do eventually get a follow-on deal to replace New START? One that goes beyond just short-term extensions and trying to paper over the strategic cracks. While anything is possible, including a new bilateral Russia-US agreement, a scenario I think might be worth exploring is how a multilateral solution could potentially work. One approach with almost any agreement, let alone arms control, is to try and keep things simple. Don't include multiple parties who could all complicate things and throw a spanner in the works, and/or try and stay focused on just one or two key issues. In the context of arms control, that might mean an agreement or convention that does nothing more than ban one particular type of weapon system, or one like New START that is a bit more complicated but only includes two parties. There are plenty of examples of those out there, but in an arms control context, they can potentially run into incentive problems. If a proposed agreement only covers one issue or system, for example, then unless you have some major incentives or pressure being applied outside the agreement, it might be hard to give the parties you'd really want to sign on a reason to do so. This might be part of the reason you end up with things like bans on anti-personnel landmines that are signed on to a bunch of countries, but not the biggest landmine users, or a cluster munition convention signed up to by none of the countries with the largest stockpiles of cluster munitions. And that's not to say these agreements achieve nothing, they do. But from an incentive perspective, there are limits to what you might expect them to achieve. With no other incentive, a country like Ukraine, with the Russian army next door, is no more likely to sign up to a cluster munition convention than Saudi Arabia is to say yes to a Just Stop Oil effort. Multilateralism might also be necessary in order to remove the perverse incentives for countries to stay outside the system, or not signing on in the first place, out of fear of what it might mean for their strategic balance with non-signatories. We've already seen that pretty clearly expressed earlier in this episode, with the United States expressing concern that if it signs a limitation agreement bilaterally with Russia, that might restrict its ability to respond via another competitor, the People's Republic of China. In that context then, from a negotiating perspective, it might make sense to bring multiple parties and multiple issues to the table at the same time, even if that means introducing a lot more complication and a lot more difficulty. Because at least, if we go back to Principles of Negotiation 101, you might at least have the tools available to you to give everyone at the table some incentive to sign on. If you imagine you had three purely hypothetical countries at the table, for example, let's call them the Emus, the Eagles, and the Cranes. If the Eagles had the most advanced missile defense systems, the Cranes the best arsenal of hypersonics, and the Emus the largest stockpile of non-strategic nuclear weapons, then if you tried to come up with a new ABM treaty, the Eagles would probably oppose it, the Cranes might try and block any hypersonic restrictions, while the Emus insisted there was no need to talk about the whole non-strategic nuclear weapon thing. Put all those issues on the table at the same time, however, and while you still might get a no-deal scenario with talks breaking down, at least they all now have something to put on the table to potentially trade. And so it's for that reason, even if it's not the most likely outcome, that I think it's worth at least thinking about how you might approach the idea of a multilateral, multi-issue nuclear treaty. And if you make certain assumptions about the nuclear powers involved, there might be some incentives for you to work with here. If you assume, for example, that no country actually wants to live in the Fallout universe, nor do they want to commit an ever-growing amount of resources to a never-ending arms race, while at the same time wanting to get the best strategic balances possible for them relative to the resources they need to commit to getting it, then multilateral agreement on at least some things might eventually be plausible. That would still leave you with the very thorny question, though, of how. How could you ever get multiple nations on the precipice of or in the middle of an expensive superweapon arms race to actually agree to sit down and chill out? In one sense, it's an unprecedented, nearly impossible challenge. And in another, more accurate sense, historically speaking, it's not. because while they certainly weren't perfect, the naval arms limitations treaties of the interwar period, Washington and later London, arguably provide a kind of proof of concept that you could potentially apply to nuclear issues as well. For these agreements, you have to go back to the 1920s. It's the post-World War I period, and the horrendously expensive superweapon of the day isn't the nuclear warhead and delivery system, it's the battleship, and to a lesser extent carriers and other warships as well. The parallel here to the present day is you had a scenario where naval power was becoming increasingly multipolar. Germany, which had been the major challenger to the incumbent Great Britain, was kind of out of the picture for a while, but you also had a relative newcomer on the block with a huge economy behind them who was building up rapidly, the United States, as well as another ambitious rising power, the Empire of Japan, and a few established incumbents who were broke, tired, and still in the game, like France and Italy. Despite the fact the world had just finished one major war, and a lot of economies, including Great Britain's, were more or less exhausted by the effort, this period was still seeing massive amounts of naval spending, as capital ships in particular quickly grew larger and more capable. Japan had ambitions to close the gap with the Western powers, especially the United States, and so was building a shit ton of ships. The United States was growing into its status as a global power and building a shit ton of ships. And Britain, despite its economic position, still had a globe-spanning empire, a vested interest in maintaining its naval advantage, even compared to other powers like the US, and so, in response to everyone else, was building a shit ton of ships. All of them were having to spend big, and a lot of them wished they didn't have to. The result in the 1920s was the Washington Naval Treaty, signed between these various former allies of World War I. The US, UK, Japan, France and Italy essentially got in a room and decided to essentially put a lid on the whole arms race thing through a couple of restrictions. For example, they limited the capability of ships. Battleships and battlecruisers could displace no more than 35,000 tons and had the calibre of their main guns capped. Carriers were capped at 27,000 tons and had maximum limits placed on their guns to stop countries just handing Damo a wingsuit and putting a 3-inch flight deck on a battleship and counting it as a carrier. All other warships were capped at no more than 10,000 tons with a maximum gun calibre of 8 inches. Part of the motive here, capping quality and displacement, not just the quantity of these things, was to remove some of the incentive to constantly replace the ships you had with newer ones. A lot of new construction was being driven by rapid capability growth. Larger ships that could mount bigger guns and more armour, and overmatch older, smaller ships that didn't have the firepower or performance to go head-to-head with them. Then you had hard restrictions, reductions, and limits. Straight off the top, Washington basically put a 10-year hard stop on new battleship and battlecruiser production. There were a few carefully negotiated exceptions, but a huge number of planned or in-construction ships were cancelled and scrapped, and large numbers of existing ships marked for retirement. That was matched with agreed maximum allowances on fleet tonnage across different ship categories. This is where a lot of the controversy at Washington arose, along with part of the secret as to how you might get multiple nations to sign on to something like this. Each country got a tonnage allowance for the likes of its battleships and battlecruisers and its aircraft carriers, but they weren't all equal. At the top of the table, provided with rough parity, were the United Kingdom and United States. This represented a compromise that gave both sides part of what they wanted. At the stroke of a pen, the British Empire gave up its long-held naval superiority, at least when it came to capital ships. Meanwhile, the United States was able to achieve parity with the United Kingdom much less expensively than if it had gone to an all-out arms race. But from the British perspective, the country was also spared from an arms race that the US was in a much better shape than the UK to afford. And while the US would get parity, in a no-deal scenario, given the US industrial capacity, it's possible the US without a deal could have gone on to significantly outbuild the Brits, as would be pretty clearly demonstrated just a couple of decades later during the Second World War. Japan essentially got 3/5 of what the British and Americans did, while the French and Italians were still technically in the game with 175,000 tons of capital ship each. The core point is that no one loved this strategic balance, but in exchange for not having to spend an absolute mint on new warships, it was a balance all of them were ultimately willing to accept. As a side note, the controversy over the balance was perhaps most pronounced in Japan, where opinion in the military and government starkly divided to the point of assassination attempts, with, to oversimplify, a dividing line between those who thought the treaty was unequal, which it was, and that it would prevent Japan building a battle fleet that could reliably defeat that of the United States, which it did, and those who suggested that didn't really matter and might actually be a great deal because Japan would struggle to build more than that many ships anyway, which again was clearly true. Admiral Yamamoto, for example, of Pearl Harbor fame, who had gone to the United States and seen its industrial capacity firsthand in the past, suggested Japan actually got a pretty good deal at Washington. Quote, "The ratio works very well for Japan. It's a treaty to restrict the other parties." End quote. Japan would eventually be the first of the signatories to walk away from Washington and the successor London Agreement, and we all know how that path would ultimately end. But for the most part, at least from a defence economics perspective, the treaties kind of worked. Fleets were able to become smaller and construction budgets dramatically cut, which potentially worked to the benefit of all the signatories, while at the same time preserving a new relative strategic balance that all of them, at least for a while, were willing to at least grudgingly accept. And even just beyond the agreed limits, Washington may have helped reduce pressure on countries to build even the maximum amount of tonnage they were allowed. Now they had the security of knowing that other powers wouldn't build past a certain limit, the urgency of actually building up to your own limit was somewhat reduced. The risk factor was dialed back. Eventually in the mid to late 30s, that starts to fall apart. But I'd argue as a proof of concept, the data is obviously there. You had a budding arms race, followed by a multilateral agreement, which temporarily, at least mostly, put the whole thing on hold. So how potentially could you apply some of that framework to modern nuclear arms limitation? Well, just as in the 1920s, you can start by recognising that not all the countries involved are in the same position or have the same interests. Russia has parallels to Great Britain, currently in the top tier, but economically not particularly well set up to hold that position if this does go to an all-out arms race. China, ironically enough, is more in a US-style position. They're not at the top of the table, but they have the economic and industrial resources necessary to get there. Beijing has an incentive to change the balance under the status quo, while the United States would firmly rather it didn't. Then you have France and also the United Kingdom in a position similar to France was back in the 1920s. Not the largest force at the table, but still a relevant one, and looking to a treaty process to potentially deliver a couple of wins. If you did succeed in getting multiple countries around the table then and wanted to apply that Washington model, it might be beneficial to put more issues on the table than just hard quantitative limits. Because then potentially you have the ability of countries to make concessions in one area, say restrictions on particular weapon types that they might have an advantage in exchange for a better deal in other areas, like overall warhead count, for example. It's important not to pretend that we have any indication that countries would be keen to make those types of concessions. The US 2019 Missile Defense Review, for example, explicitly said that, quote, "The United States will not accept any limitations on the development or deployment of missile defense capabilities," end quote. But at least hypothetically, the nations could trade restrictions on certain systems that they valued against those that might be valued more highly by the other countries at the table. For example, a very rough equivalent to something like the caliber or displacement limits in the Washington and London treaties would be restrictions that apply to particular nuclear delivery systems. We already have precedent for this with things like INF, where Washington and Moscow both recognised that it was probably in both of their interests not to have a whole bunch of weapons out there that provided really short warning times and encouraged decision makers to potentially have a bit of a twitchy finger. An argument I've often seen raised in the United States against rebooting INF, beyond the alleged Russian cheating, was that the original agreement didn't bind other powers. And so the United States was swearing off entire classes of weapons system, including conventional ground-launched missiles in a valuable range bracket, which other countries, from Iran to China, were openly able to field. In a multilateral agreement, maybe you'd have a better chance to make some kind of restriction work. It might also provide an opportunity to look at weapon systems that are emerging but haven't really been fielded, or at least fielded in large numbers yet. Nuclear-tipped hypersonic cruise missiles, for example, are potentially concerning for the same reason a lot of the old INF weapons were: very low warning time. All else being equal, from a negotiating perspective, the two easiest times to ban something are, one, when you have an advantage in that area, and so everyone else would improve their relative position if they agreed to give it up as well, or two, a position where no one is really fielding it yet, where there's no sunk cost to be concerned about, no doctrinal and training commitment, no industrial base and supply chain to be protected. So if you're going to put specific limits or restrictions on things like nuclear-tipped HCMs or HDVs, the sooner you try, the easier it might be. It might also be an opportunity to take bans that you might think would be common sense or obvious, and convert those into actual explicit legal obligations. Candidates here might be fully autonomous nuclear weapons, for example. Because of all the ways the world as we know it could end, Nuke GPT hallucinating a launch order has to be about the stupidest. You could potentially require certain security and safety standards, make something like a permissive action link compulsory, or potentially go after weapons that are potentially so destabilising or dangerous that we might be better off if they didn't exist. The salted nuke, for example, is a hypothetical type of nuclear warhead, which is specifically designed to increase the amount of radioactive fallout, rendering large areas uninhabitable for a significant amount of time in a giant middle finger to future generations. That would have very little immediate military utility, but also be incredibly horrifying. So hopefully remains on the list of things where humanity has figured out the how, but decides to hold back on the why. An example of a category that's less hypothetical would be nuclear weapons that are explicitly designed to be man-portable. This Cold War classic, for example, was the Special Atomic Demolition Munition, a still fairly bulky backpack or duffel bag nuke essentially, but one, as you can see, that you could potentially parachute with and use for demolition work. Suffice to say that hypermobile warheads like this probably aren't great for strategic stability, and might be an example of the kind of thing that nations might have an incentive to rule out. If for no other reason, then you can imagine a horror scenario where a non-state actor gets their hands on these things somehow, and the world has to grapple with the prospect of a deniable or at least semi-deniable nuclear detonation. And then of course there's the big one, the issue of non-strategic nuclear weapons. As noted before, these previously dodged the ban hammer or any restrictions under New START, and I think it's an open question as to whether any future agreements will try and tackle the issue of them and their proliferation head-on. This would probably be one of the areas where Russia would have the incentive to be reluctant on agreeing to any sweeping restrictions, but in the context of a wider deal, who knows what, if any, conditions might ultimately prove agreeable. Going by the Washington precedent though, some capability restrictions might be easier to agree than settling on the details of any quantitative restrictions. The issue here would be that different parties are likely to have very different expectations. You can imagine Russia, for example, if for no other reason than national pride, wanting to stay equal to the United States. But if China then bargains for an arsenal much closer in size to the current US one, you can imagine US decision makers arguing that when you combine the Russian and Chinese arsenals together, the United States now finds itself at a significant nuclear disadvantage, and trying to negotiate a different deal instead. As to where those kind of negotiations could eventually end up, your guess is as good as mine. But history suggests the trick to a deal isn't giving every country exactly what they want. That'll never happen. It's giving every signatory something that they consider better than the alternative, better than an unrestricted arms race, with all the risks and costs that involves. The core point here isn't that a multilateral deal is likely, and with the stances we've seen out of some capitals at least, for the moment it looks more like a long shot. Instead, the point here is that in a post-New START world, the future isn't binary. It isn't that we either get New START remade or we get an uncontrolled international arms race. It's that there's a wide spectrum of outcomes, from no new agreement but very little changing, through to, at one extreme, a new multinational treaty, and on the other hand, Seek.com suddenly getting absolutely barraged with job offers for technically qualified personnel in a highly energetic field. So where does all of that potentially leave us going forward? I think the only honest answer to give at this point is that, at least in the short term, we don't know. The point of that last discussion wasn't to highlight what would or what was likely to happen. It was to illustrate how you might apply some basic negotiations principles and historical precedent to potentially get to some kind of deal. But so far, I don't think we can be sure whether we're going to see an act of diplomatic can-kicking, a new bilateral agreement, some kind of multilateral negotiations, or a no-deal scenario. But what I think we can say is this. For decades now, a downward trend in global nuclear armaments has been the norm. Around the peak of the disarmament effort, the number of warheads being disassembled annually just in the United States actually crossed the 4-figure threshold. And it might have felt that a world with fewer nuclear weapons and fewer nuclear risks might be normal or even potentially inevitable. But as far as the strategic pressures go, it really isn't. A new nuclear arms race, or arms races, with all the costs and risks that might involve, certainly might not be inevitable, but it's also not impossible. And so where global nuclear arsenals go now in a post-New START world is going to depend a lot on how leaders choose to approach it. The question may just be papered over with a temporary extension, or a world without nuclear arms limits might just become the new normal. And for better or worse, as is often the case, only time will tell. And okay, channel update to close out. I know there's a lot going on in 2026, and in the coming weeks, we're going to have good reason to talk about some of it. But I really didn't want the formal passing of New START to pass without a mention. Realistically, some of the most unique and valuable parts of the agreement, which were those transparency mechanisms, had already been defunct for years. But I still think it's worth thinking through the effects of the formal end of an arms control regime that, for many of us, has basically represented the normal over the course of most or all of our lives. In any case, I hope you found the discussion interesting. Patrons, as promised by the time this one goes live, your topic poll should also be active. And then in the coming weeks, I'll also be opening up nominations for potential topics for the first week of April, where, as per tradition and barring any major unforeseen events, the scope of potential topics might be a bit wider and more relaxed than normal. For everyone else, thank you very much for your ongoing engagement and support as always. And with any luck, I'll see you all again next week.